Welcome to Introduction to JavaScript for Apex Developers. This is Module 3, Working with the DOM and jQuery. In this module, I'll start off talking about the DOM and then I'll explain what jQuery is. Then I'll show you how you can select, traverse, and manipulate elements within the DOM using jQuery. Then I'll provide an overview of events in Apex, and finally I'll show you how you can create event listeners using code. HTML versus the DOM. Hopefully everybody watching this is at least a little familiar with HTML. That's the markup language that a browser uses to render a web page. In the beginning of the web, that was the whole story. A static HTML document would be sent across the network, and the browser would simply render what was in it. But browser manufacturers wanted to provide the ability to manipulate what was in the page using code. For that, they needed a standard, and that standard is the Document Object Model, or DOM for short. You can think of the DOM as two things. First, an in-memory representation of the underlying HTML document. Because the HTML document is hierarchical in nature, so is the DOM, and that's why it's sometimes referred to as the DOM tree. Second, there's an API, or a set of methods, for working with and manipulating that memory structure. And of course, those changes are then reflected immediately in the web page. Let's take a look at how this works. Here we have a very simple HTML document. It starts with the HTML tag, and then beneath that you see the body tag. You could say that the body is the child of the HTML tag, and that the HTML tag is the parent of the body. Within the body tag, there's a paragraph tag with some text, and then a div with an image, example.png. When the browser goes to render the page, it starts by first creating this DOM tree, or the in-memory representation of the HTML content. Only rather than HTML, we now have DOM elements. We start with the HTML element, and then beneath that we have the body, and of course we have the paragraph with its text and the div with its image. Each of these elements has methods which allow us to manipulate its properties and content, and that's really what the DOM is all about. The DOM is technically not part of JavaScript, the language. These days you can run JavaScript in a mid-tier environment, for example, like Node.js, in which case you're not going to have access to the DOM, at least not usually. The DOM is one of many what are called web APIs, or APIs that are designed to make JavaScript useful within a browser. In browsers, the DOM API will be exposed to us via the document property of the window or global object. Now that you know a little bit about the DOM, let's talk about jQuery. In the early days of the DOM, the APIs were not so great. They were incredibly difficult to use, and to make matters worse, they were implemented differently in different browsers. So it wasn't at all uncommon to see conditional logic in JavaScript that said, if you're running in IE, then execute this code path. For everything else, execute a different code path. jQuery came in and solved this problem. It was released in 2006 when the DOM APIs were still a big mess, and it provided a simple API that worked consistently across all major browsers. Today, the DOM APIs are improving. There's a website here. You might not need jQuery.com. You can go there, enter the name of a method you're using in jQuery, and it'll show you the native DOM APIs you could use to accomplish the same thing. However, jQuery will be in Apex for the foreseeable future, and I still think its APIs are easier to use and learn than native DOM APIs, so there's still a lot of value in learning to use jQuery. Using jQuery is typically a three-step process. The first step is to include it in your web page, which with Apex is already done for you. When you include jQuery in a web page, it creates a function named jQuery in the global scope. At the same time, it also creates a shortcut reference, the $, which points to that same function. In Apex, there's also apex.jQuery, and normally all three of these would point to the same function. However, it is possible to have more than a single instance of jQuery in a web page. It might happen, say, if you included a plugin in your application. And if that's the case and you wanted to be sure that you were using the same instance of jQuery that the Apex team is using, that's when you would refer to apex.jQuery. The second step to using jQuery is to select something. So of course you'll just invoke the jQuery function and you'll pass it a string known as a selector or a query. jQuery will then return to you a jQuery object, which wraps the elements you've selected in the DOM and then provides a nice API for you to work with and manipulate those objects. And of course that's what you'll do in step 3. You'll do something with what you've selected. You may manipulate the DOM or traverse it, work with effects, events, and more. Let's take a look at some of the things you can do with jQuery. We'll start here with the basic selectors. The first one you need to know is how to select by ID. For that, the syntax is to put the hashtag in front of the ID you'd like to select. In the example on the right here, you see the shortcut reference to jQuery, the $, and I'm invoking that function, passing along a string hashtag message. And that should get at most one element because the ID property in the DOM works similarly to a primary key in a table. It's not enforced the same way, but that's the basic idea. The next one you need to learn is the class selector. For that, you just swap out the hashtag for the period, follow that with the name of the class you'd like to select. In the example on the right, I'm selecting all of the elements in the web page that have a class of boring. Unlike the ID property, it's possible to have many elements in a web page with the same class, and it's also possible for any given element to have more than one class. The next one is the element selector. For that, you don't need to do anything fancy, just put the name of the element or tag. In this case, I'm selecting all of the unordered lists in the page. It's worth pointing out that you can combine multiple selectors into a single selector using a comma-separated list. So in this example, I'm selecting all of the elements with a class of fun, as well as the element with an ID equal to message. While we're on the topic of selectors, I want to point out that what DOM APIs typically return, DOM elements, is different from what jQuery APIs return, a jQuery object. The jQuery object acts as a wrapper around the underlying DOM elements that were selected. There could be anywhere from 0 to many DOM elements. It's the jQuery object that provides the easy-to-use APIs which, as you'll see here in a moment, are often chainable, making jQuery code very easy to write. However, sometimes you may need access to the underlying DOM APIs, and if you ever find that's the case, you can use either the square bracket syntax or the get method to get at those underlying elements. Let's work through the example on the right. On line 1, I'm using the native DOM API document.getElementById to get the element with an ID of message 1, and that's going to be a DOM element. Then on line 2, I'm using a jQuery selector to go after the same element, but that will return a jQuery object. Developers often prepend or append the $sign to the variable name just as a visual cue that this is a jQuery object with different methods. Down below, I'm using the strict equality or identity operator to compare the two, and as you'd expect, these are not the same. However, I can use square bracket syntax, which is kind of like indexing into an array, to pluck out one of the DOM elements. When we compare those, they are the same. Alternatively, I can use the get method as well. To show you some examples of using jQuery, I created this really simple web page. There's a question at the top, how are you feeling? And then a list of 6 basic emotions: happy, sad, fearful, disgusted, angry, and surprised. And then an input and a submit button at the bottom. These emotions were actually identified by a psychologist named Paul Ekman in the 70s as universal human emotions. Here's the HTML I used to build that web page. You can see the question at the top, how are you feeling? And then we have our unordered list of emotions. What's interesting about that list of emotions is that only happy is positive, the majority are negative, and then the last one, surprised, well, that's neutral. Kind of depends on the surprise. You'll find the inputs here at the very bottom of the page. If I wanted to select the element that has an ID equal to question, this is the selector I would use. Alternatively, I could target the element that has an ID equal to emotions-list. Here I'm using a class selector to select any elements with a class equal to positive. In this case, I just get one element. But if I switch that class name to negative, I get 4 elements. Here I'm using the element or tag selector. I'm selecting all of the divs in the web page. And finally, I'm selecting the 2 inputs at the bottom of the page. Okay, let's look at traversal. I mentioned before that you want to select elements and then work with what you've selected. And if you can write a jQuery selector that gets exactly the elements you're interested in, that's perfect, but it's not always possible. Sometimes the elements you're interested in don't have an ID or a class that makes them easy to select. In those cases, you can leverage the hierarchical nature of the DOM and traverse the DOM, or sometimes called walk the DOM, to get at the elements you're actually interested in. Here we see a variety of methods to do exactly that. We'll start with the ones that go up the DOM. Parent goes exactly 1 level up, whereas parents goes all the way up the DOM tree. Closest can go all the way up the DOM tree, but it stops where you tell it to. In this example, I'm starting with an li that has a class of done and going up to its parent element. Next, we'll look at methods going down the DOM tree, starting with children, which goes exactly 1 level down, or find, which goes all the way down the DOM tree. In this case, I'm starting with unordered lists on the page and telling it to find the list items beneath it. Generally, I could have just used children here, but if there were nested lists, I can use find to go all the way down. Here we have functions we can use to select the siblings of an element. Siblings obviously gets both sides, whereas next only gets the elements that come after an element, and prev would get the ones that came previously. Here I'm starting with an li that has a class of pending and going to the next element in the DOM tree. Sometimes you select more than you're actually interested in, and you can use these functions here, EQ, filter, first and last, to filter down the elements selected to only what you're interested in. In this case, I'm selecting all the list items on the page, and then I'm filtering that down to just the second element in the list. Remember, it's a zero-based index language. Let's see some examples of traversal. Here I'm starting with the element that has an ID equal to question, and I'm using parent to go to the div that's wrapping it. Then I'm using find to go back down the DOM tree. This time I'm selecting all the list items beneath that div. And then I'm using EQ to filter that list down. I'm only interested in this case in the third list element. As you can see, traversal is a very powerful technique that makes it easy to get to any element you may be interested in. What you're also seeing is an example of chaining, which jQuery made very popular. The initial selector returns a jQuery object with a single element, and then we're able to use the parent method of the jQuery object to go up 1 level in the hierarchy. But this method also returns a jQuery object, allowing us to chain then and use find, and find as the same, allowing us to use EQ. This chaining technique makes it very easy to write jQuery code. Once you've selected the elements you're interested in, whether via selection or traversal, you can then work with what you've selected. Here we have a few different groups of functions. The first group is for adding and removing CSS classes. In the example on the right, I'm starting with the list items that have a class of done, and I'm removing the class done and then adding the class pending. Next up, we have functions you can use to modify attributes of elements. Adder is very commonly used for that. And in the example, I'm selecting the inputs on the page and setting their disabled attribute equal to disabled. That may look a little strange at first, but this is just how HTML works. And in this case, adder is acting as a setter because I'm passing it 2 parameters. If I only pass it 1 parameter, then adder would return the current value of the disabled attribute. Of course, you can add new content to the DOM. We have a few methods here that you can use for that. Here I'm selecting the unordered list on the page, and then I'm appending the list item here at the bottom of that unordered list. If I wanted to put it at the top of the list, I could use prepend instead. Of course, if we can add content, we can also take it away, and we have remove and empty for that. In this case, I'm selecting an unordered list and calling empty on it, which will remove any list items beneath it. If I called remove, it would also remove the unordered list itself. And finally, we can affect not only CSS classes as we saw before, but also the styles directly. So in this case, I'm using CSS to set the color of this H1 element to red. Let's work through a few manipulation examples. In this case, I'm starting with the list element that is a class of neutral, and I'm invoking add class to add another class. And if you look down there, you'll see that this element now has two classes. And then I'm using remove class to remove the previous neutral class. And now if there were any CSS styles that made a positive emotion look positive, this one would now look positive. Here I'm using a more advanced selector. This is called an attribute selector to select the input that has a type equal to text. And then I'm using adder to set its disabled property equal to disabled. That wasn't there before, but after calling this, the end user would be unable to work with that input because it's disabled. In this case, I'm starting with the element that has an ID of question. And if you read the text, how are you feeling? If for whatever reason you were unable to change how that was worded on the server side, you could just use jQuery's text method to pass in some new text like, how do you feel? Finally, in this case, I'm starting with the element that has an ID equal to emotions list, and then I'm using append to add another list item at the bottom of that list. Okay, let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about events. I like to think about events a little bit like triggers in the database, only rather than respond to some kind of DML or DDL operation, we're able to write code that responds to a user as they interact with a web page. Browsers will automatically trigger many different events, such as the click on a button, but it's also possible to trigger custom events, and the Apex team makes use of this for various components within Apex, such as the refresh of a report region, as we'll see here in a bit. When you start working with events in the Dynamic Action Framework, you'll see that they're grouped into three different categories: browser, framework, and component events. I'll just touch on a few of these within each category, but if you'd like to know more about all of them, you can use the link at the bottom to go to the documentation. Here we see the most generic of the browser events. On the left-hand side, you'll see the name that you're shown in the Dynamic Action Framework, and to the right of that, the actual name that's used in JavaScript code. Finally, on the right, you'll find a description of how that event works. Oftentimes, the name of the event in the Dynamic Action Framework will align nicely with the actual event name used in code, as we see here with change. But sometimes you'll notice that, as is the case with page load, the name displayed in the Dynamic Action Framework does not match up at all. I'll describe this particular difference a little bit later. The change event is one of the most common events you'll be working with as a user interacts with a form. That event will be triggered when a control loses focus and its value has been changed since it first gained focus. Staying within the browser events, here I've broken out the events related to a user interacting with the keyboard. As you can see, there's a slight difference between key down and key press, in that key down will be triggered anytime a key on the keyboard is pressed, whereas key press is only triggered if that press resulted in text being entered, say into a text field. So delete or shift would not trigger the key press event. Of course, there are similar events you can use to respond to the user's interaction with the mouse, click being the most popular of those, but there's also double click, and you can even, for example, respond to a user hovering over a certain element with mouse enter, and then off of that element with mouse leave. The last of the browser events are those meant to work with a finger or pointer on a mobile device such as a cell phone or a tablet. As you can see in the event names, they all start with Apex. So these are not native events in the browser, but if you are building a mobile specific application, you'll probably want to take a look at these. A good example is the press event, which is triggered when the pointer is pushed down for longer than a quarter second. The next group of events are the framework events. You can think of these as events that are related to Apex, but at a higher or more generic level than the component events we'll see next. One of the more popular ones is after refresh. You can use that event to respond to the refresh of a report, a chart, and even various items within Apex. Dialog closed is becoming increasingly important. If a user opens a page as a dialog, whether modal or non-modal, that event will be fired when that page is closed. The events you see listed here at the top are the ones you'll see in the Dynamic Action Framework, but I found a few other events that I think you should be aware of. The first here, you'll find in the Universal Theme application, if you go to the Reference section and then JavaScript Events. Probably the easiest way to get to that app is to go to this URL here, apex.oracle.com/ut for Universal Theme. There you'll see events like Theme 42 ready and Theme 42 layout changed. So if those sound important for what you're doing, you'll know where to find those events. Also, check out the API documentation on the Apex namespace. I found some events there such as Apex Ready End and Apex Window Resized that may come in handy. The last group is the component events. Here we're seeing just the events related to the interactive grid. As a new and important component within Apex, the interactive grid has lots of different events that you can leverage as the user is working with the interactive grid. The save event is perhaps one of the more important ones. You can use that to do something else on the page when the interactive grid's data has been saved. As before, the events you see at the top here are the ones you'll find in the Dynamic Action Framework, but you can consult the JavaScript API documentation to learn about more events such as report settings change and view model create. In addition to the interactive grid, you'll find component events for the calendar, faceted search, tree, text field with autocomplete, markdown editor, and the shuttle. I ran out of room to include descriptions of these events here, but I think the names are really indicative of how they're used. Of course, you can consult the JavaScript API documentation to learn more about these events and new ones. The last thing I want to mention regarding the component events is that if you install a plugin in Apex, it's possible that that plugin will add additional events to the Dynamic Action Framework, and this is the category where you would find those events. Okay, now that you have an idea of what events are and the types of events that you can use in your applications, let's take a look at how you can create event listeners and work with them programmatically. The easiest way to create event bindings with code is using jQuery's on method. In the example below, I've created an input with an ID of input test, and then beneath that in the JavaScript code, I'm using jQuery to select the input, and then I'm invoking its on method, passing it two parameters. The first parameter is a string, and that's the name of the event that you want to listen to. And the second parameter is what's known as a callback function. This is a function that will be invoked in the future when this event occurs. Keep in mind from Module 1 that functions in JavaScript are first class, meaning they're just like any other data type, numbers, strings, booleans, whatever. What that means is I could have written this a slightly different way. I could have written it as a named function instead. Here, I've defined the function handleChange, and then I've simply bound a reference to that function below here in the call to on. Both of these are exactly the same, just two different ways of writing it, and they're both very common, so you need to be familiar with both. Now, in the callback function, or the event handler, it's often the case that you need some kind of context about the event that occurred. And in a jQuery callback, you can get that context one of two ways. The first is via the parameter that will be passed to your callback function. This is going to be the event object. You can call it whatever you like, but it'll be the same object. And this event object is going to have all kinds of information about the event that occurred. You can just use console log to log it out and see all the different kinds of details that you can access. In addition, you also have the keyword this, and within the callback function, this is going to be equal to the DOM element, which in this case has changed. Now I mentioned the difference before between DOM elements and jQuery objects. So if you want to use the jQuery methods, then you'll first need to change the DOM element into a jQuery object. And you can do that by invoking the jQuery function and passing the keyword this. Note that I'm not passing the string this, I'm passing the actual keyword or the reference to the DOM element. One of the most common events that Apex and web developers in general often work with is the loading of a web page. Developers often want to execute JavaScript code as soon as possible, maybe to hide something or show something on the page, but there's always been a difficulty because you cannot use JavaScript to reference elements in the DOM that have not yet been loaded in the DOM tree. The browser is going to parse the HTML document from top to bottom and build up the DOM tree as it goes. So if it encounters your JavaScript code in the middle of that and you're trying to work with elements that have not yet been loaded in the DOM tree, it's not going to work. So we needed some kind of events for this. The first event, the one that we've had the longest, is the load event on the window object. But the problem with the load event is that it waited for frames, objects, and even images, which can be fairly large. All of that had to load, and then the load event on the window object would fire. And the problem with that is if you were trying to hide something, the user would see it until the function executed, at which point it would be hidden. That was something that we referred to as page flicker, and it's not desirable. We want to reduce that as much as possible. jQuery came up with a new event, an event that waited just as long as the DOM tree took to load and immediately fired thereafter. Initially, it was the ready event on the document or DOM, which made sense. But since then, there has been a new event actually added to the DOM standard, so the ready event didn't make a lot of sense. So the new and preferred method of adding a callback to the DOM ready event in the web page is simply to invoke the jQuery function and pass it a callback function. This is a way of saying to jQuery, hey, as soon as the DOM tree is ready to go ahead and execute this function. Okay, let's see who's been paying attention. This is the last of the pop quizzes. Which of these event bindings is correct? You can take as much time as you need to answer this. Just hit pause and then hit play when you're ready to continue. Okay, what'd you guess? A or B? Let's work through them, starting here with A. I've defined a function named handleChange. It takes an event and then simply logs that out to the console. And then on line 5, I've selected the element with an ID of input test, and I've used on to bind to the change event, and I'm binding the handleChange function, or so it seems. What I'm actually doing is invoking the handleChange function. And if you look above, you see that this function does not actually return a value, which is essentially like returning undefined. So what I'm really doing is binding undefined to the change event, which of course is not going to work. Now with option B, on the other hand, the function's exactly the same, but what I'm binding here is a reference to the function. Remember, we don't want to invoke the function now. We want the function to be invoked when the change event occurs. So the correct answer is B. The last thing I want to speak about with respect to events is event dispatching and DOM event flow. Imagine we're looking at a web page here, and it has the window and document. Of course, we have the HTML web page with a body. It has a table in it, a table body, which has a row, and there's a table data element within the row. Now, imagine you click the table data element. It would have been impossible for you to do that without also having clicked the table row, the table body, the table, and so on all the way up to the window. That just has to do with the hierarchical nature of HTML. Well, to handle this situation, the event actually goes through a flow, and it starts with the capture phase. In the capture phase, the event travels from the top part all the way down until it gets finally to the triggering element, at which point it's at the target phase, and finally the event will travel back up the DOM tree in what's known as the bubbling phase. Now, almost always when we create an event listener, we're attaching the event listener to the bubbling phase. We almost never use the capture or target phases. You may be thinking, well, if we don't use the other phases, then why should I care about event dispatching? Well, we need to understand event dispatching to take advantage of a technique known as event delegation. Imagine here we're looking at an Apex report, and we have some rows, and within each row there's a button, and what we want to do is make it so that when the button is clicked, we execute some code. Assuming that these buttons have a class of report-button, we might add some code to the page like this. We say, if the report button is clicked, then execute this callback function. Works all fine and well until somebody clicks this refresh report button. When they do that, Apex uses Ajax to go out to the server, and it brings back new HTML. What it then does, it takes the old rows in these buttons with their event bindings, and it removes them from the DOM, and then injects the new HTML content into the DOM, but these buttons do not have the event bindings. So if you click them, it's just not going to work. However, the on method can be used a little bit differently to leverage event delegation. What we do here, we start with an element higher up in the DOM, because when you click refresh report, yeah, you replace some rows in a table, but you're not replacing everything in the DOM. Eventually, if you go high enough up in the DOM, you'll find something that is not being replaced. So the idea is to start at some level higher up in the DOM, and then pass a new second parameter, which is what you would have started with before. So what we're saying here is, when the event eventually travels up to this element in the DOM, then jQuery can interrogate the event object to see if it matches this selector here, and if so, then it will execute the callback function. The last thing I want to point out is that you actually do not have to write jQuery code to take advantage of event delegation within Apex. It's actually already baked in to the dynamic action framework. At the parent level, the dynamic action, if you go into the advanced settings, you'll find a setting called event scope. All you need to do is set that to dynamic to leverage event delegation. You can optionally specify where you want to place the event listener, but the default, if you leave it blank, is document, and the event will eventually travel up to the document, so you actually don't need to specify anything there at all. Okay, let's take a look at what you'll be doing in the hands-on lab for Module 3. As before, I'm going to start by going to bit.ly/js for Apex. That'll go ahead and load up the hands-on labs for this workshop. And of course, I'm assuming you've already worked through the introduction and setup. If not, you'll want to go ahead and do that and install the sample database application. At that point, you can navigate to Module 3, working with the DOM and jQuery. In Part 1, you'll be working through some basic selection, traversal, and manipulation of the DOM. Here you see some work with attributes. A little further down, hiding and showing elements. And beneath that, this is navigating the DOM and working with classes. In Part 2, you'll start working with events and event delegation, starting with a basic event binding, and then some event delegation. And in the last example, you'll put a few things together. You'll work with event delegation, walking the DOM, changing content, and so on. Once you finish with that, congratulations, you've completed the workshop. I hope you found this useful, and if that's the case, please keep an eye out for some more advanced content I hope to have out in the near future. Until then, bye.